Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in and welcome back to the Ghost Biker Garage. We've got a special guest tonight, a very talented investigator and close friend of mine, Jake Fife. We had him on the New Year's Eve special with several other friends, and so you kind of got to get a little taste of what he does and some of the different things, but we had more to talk about, and he's got some interesting stories about his time starting out as a child investigator, as well as some of the different locations that he's investigated. So we'll give everyone just a few minutes to get on here before I bring him on. But I want to say hi to Chris Sumner and Vicki Norris. Thank you guys for tuning in here. Looks like there's a few other people on. I can't see who you are unless you comment over here. So feel free, if you have any questions or any comments regarding any of our conversation, feel free to just comment in the comments over here. We've got Peppy Purple Eyes, Glenn Morgan from Maryland, hello, and Donald Martin from Mississippi, and Brian Baum from Bearded Paranormal. So I'm going to go ahead and not waste any time because we're going to try to keep everything to about an hour here. I'm going to go ahead and bring on my guest, Jake Fife. Hey, Jake. Oops. Let's see. You've got your mic muted there.
Yeah. Sorry about that. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I had a blast on the New Year's Eve show, and I'm honored that you invited me on so soon.
Absolutely. I know we talked a little bit before the show and then spent some time talking afterwards. And I thought those were awesome things that we needed to share with everybody. You know, we just had real good conversations. So why don't you take a little time and tell us about yourself?
So my name is Jake Fife. I am the co-founder of Fife Paranormal based out of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. I actually turned 21 on Saturday, so that's going to be pretty cool. And it will be my 11th year as an in-the-field investigator. Now, I've had paranormal experiences all my life. You know, that my earliest childhood memory is actually seeing shadow figures down the hallway from where my bed was. And my dad, he's the other member of Fife Paranormal. He had been an investigator since, the late 80s, early 90s. So he had just a wealth of knowledge. And I had an experience when I was about 9 years old. We were living in southern West Virginia, deep in the coal fields, and we were about to move. And one of my favorite things to do is I would come home from school, and I would go out onto the porch by myself, and I would let my two Australian shepherds, Lance and Lady, onto the porch to play with them. And so I was sitting there, I was playing with the dogs, and about 50 yards up the ridge from our house, they were building a water tank. And there was, a bunch of hay and stuff around where they were just doing the digging. They got maybe a third of the tank up at this point. And I just remember something catching my eye up there. And, being 9 years old, I was a little paranoid of, coyotes or bears. And, I didn't want to get eaten alive. I kind of wanted to see adulthood.
That's
so anytime, it is very healthy. It's self-preservationist. But anytime there was movement, I was quickly drawn to it very quickly. So of course, I saw this movement, I looked up, and there were two shadow figures that walked out behind the water tank. And it was weird because, it wasn't one of those, I saw them for like 2 seconds and they were gone. I saw two figures fully walk out, stand, 10 yards away from it and just look at me. And it was weird. They were so far away, but it felt like we were making, serious eye contact. And I just remember being absolutely frozen. And it was crazy because the two figures, one looked male and the other looked female, but they looked like Native American warriors. And it was weird because I remember seeing the guy, he was standing like this. He had it looked like a spear in his right hand. He had, a headdress on. And the female spirit, I could see hair out the back. And she was slightly behind him as if she was, kind of nervous. But they were looking directly at me. Mm-hmm. And I just remember, I wasn't terrified. I was more curious than anything. And I remember my two dogs, kindest dogs in the world. They immediately turn, look up to the water tank, and just start growling, just this low rumble. And then they started barking. I've never heard dogs bark like that before. It sounded like they were, like they were combating an enemy, basically. And they charge up the ridge towards these figures, full on sprint. And I remember the female figure kind of went back behind the tank. And I remember the male figure looked at the dogs and then looked at me, did like a nod, and then walked back. So I'm still frozen, just standing there. And I'm like, obviously those are two people messing with me. They're going to walk out the other side. So I waited and waited. I never saw anyone. And my dogs went up to the water tank, and they must have circled that thing at least 10 times. And, they looked as confused as I did because they didn't see anything. So we went up there later, didn't see any footprints, nothing. Wow. So we moved into the house in Virginia where I currently am now. And we started hearing footsteps. Stuff would move. At one point, we saw our kitchen drawer where we had our silverware literally pop out. We watched it open and then close, just, while we were watching TV. And at that moment, I asked my dad, I was like, I know you're into the paranormal stuff. I know you used to do this stuff with my aunt and some of my family. Teach me what you know. And so that's kind of what started my paranormal journey was, a quest for answers. And slowly, between then and now, it's kind of morphed into a quest for answers / helping people out because, as I started to learn more about the paranormal community, started interacting with people, that had the same beliefs I did, same experiences, I started figuring out, some people are actually having problems and they're terrified of stuff that they're experiencing. And, I wanted to help them out because I like helping people out. So people would come up to me with the question, hey, this just happened. We're scared. What do we do? And so, that's taken up the main part of why I do this is I like to help people out. And I want to give people answers while I search for answers myself.
Did your dad ever try to figure out what was going on in your house? I mean, if it was something maybe that followed him home or something related to the land or the house itself, did you all ever figure anything out with that?
It's always been a running joke with us and our family that we're just haunted people. And, if really all I can remember, every house I've ever lived in has been haunted. We've had something happen. So, we just kind of accept at this point that, it's us and that, we just happen to pick places where there are some spirits already. And then, it just kind of accelerates from there. But that's kind of our working theory.
Gotcha. And that's great that he was real supportive of you and you wanting to get started and learn from him. So I know that can sometimes be a controversial topic in the paranormal because there's not a lot of young investigators. So so when you started, I know a lot of different of the commercial locations, some of them have age restrictions, So where did you start investigating? Were there any of those specific popular locations that you were able to investigate at, or did you have to go and is that sort of where you started with your local legends and doing more of the more obscure places that a lot of people don't know about?
That's basically where that started. I had always been interested in local legends. Growing up in Southern West Virginia, the big one for us was Bigfoot. Everyone in my class was, oh, I've seen Bigfoot. Yeah, I saw this while hunting or something like that. So that's kind of where that started. For people that don't know, I'm just as into cryptids and UFOs as I am the paranormal. And it kind of started, I immediately wanted to go 0 to 100 because I would see, places on ghost hunters like the Stanley Hotel or the St. Augustine Lighthouse. And I would want to go there. I'd be like, I have to go there now because it looked like, stuff happening. And these people had answers. And, I contacted St. Albans, I know, when I was really young. I contacted a few other places, but they all said you had to be 18 to go. So, I asked my dad, and he said that, he got his start doing local cemeteries. Very lucky on my property. We actually have 3 abandoned buildings. We have an abandoned barn, caretaker's house, and then an old kitchen. So kind of where I started out. And believe it or not, my first EVP recorder, my dad had an old cassette recorder. He had to load the blank cassette into an external. That's where I got my start, was learning how to load that. And then I would take it inside to the dining room, rewind the tape, press play. And it was funny because, the volume on it was ear piercing, where it was, literally late 80s. And so I'd be up against the table with it like this. I probably have temporary deafness in one ear because of it. And it'd be cool because sometimes I would actually hear stuff. And they're like, oh, crap, you can't just hit pause and, drag it with the icon back a little bit. You have to seriously, hold in the rewind button and hope you didn't rewind to the beginning. So that's where I got started. Really, the first year while I was getting my feet under me, I did stuff around the house, not usually inside the house.
Yeah.
And then I started doing local cemeteries. When I would visit family, they would take me to cemeteries, or, there's always a haunted road, it seems like, in West Virginia and Virginia. And so we would go there. And then slowly I would start going to different places. Like the first place we investigated as Fife Paranormal was back in 2015, was the Stanton Train Depot here in Stanton, Virginia. And that was the first location I investigated. But my first overnight wasn't until April of 2015 when I investigated with the group here in Stanton, Montgomery Hall and Montgomery Hall Park, which was a really cool location. We were only there, I think it was like 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. So, we weren't there that long. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where I cut my teeth. And it was just doing stuff like that, honing my craft, getting more knowledge, testing theories, my equipment, until finally I was able to investigate the bigger locations.
Well, and that's what I like about following your post is you're very theory driven. And, you're always, when you go investigate these places, it always seems like you come out and, have some type of interesting theory. So that's one of the things that I really enjoy about your investigations and your posts, because you're always trying new stuff and always questioning things. And as an investigator, that's a very refreshing thing to see.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It also helps that I'm into a lot of vintage stuff. I collect vinyl records. I've got an 8mm camera. I just love vintage stuff. And, sometimes when I'm researching history, like 60s music, 60s history, 70s, I'll run across some obscure ghost story and they'll mention an investigator. So I'll be like, well, who's this investigator from the 1960s? And that'll lead me into all sorts of theories. And that's kind of where, all that comes from.
Mm-hmm. Well, did you use what tools did you use back then when you were a kid? Did you simply just use your recorders and that sort of thing, or did you have any other tools that you would use?
It was basically just me and a tape recorder. Or when I was 12 for Christmas, I got an Olympus voice recorder. And I still use it for note taking, but it's being an EVP recorder have since been retired. But that was basically all I had. And it was cool because, I didn't show up to these places with like pocketfuls of, equipment and stuff like that. And then also it allowed me to test different EVP theories. I knew that recorder backwards and forwards. Whenever I did pick up something strange, I knew, it doesn't mess up like this. And when it did mess up or there was something wrong with the audio, I knew how to fix it because I had taken the time to learn, the insides and out of that voice recorder.
Absolutely. And then, you can kind of tell those little nuances if you have sometime, certain sounds or certain pops and creaks, or if it reacts a certain way, if it's your recorder versus if it's the location. I mean, for me, that's one of my favorite ways to investigate is just with a recorder. I've got all these bells and whistles and everything, but the best EVPs I've ever gotten have just been straight out of the air with the recorder.
Yeah. I mean, you can't beat that stuff.
No. And that's sort of what you do with your videos now, correct? Is mostly, I mean, I know you use equipment, but are you still pretty much just a audio and video person?
I'm mainly audio and video. I do use the Spirit Box now more than any tool. The Spirit Box is one of the toughest tools to use because I was a big skeptic of it. I'm still somewhat of a skeptic of it, but I used it once on a ghost tour at the Stanton Train Depot, and I was sold on it. But, you have to train your ear when you're using the Spirit Box because, there is so much radio bleed through. And it took me about 1.5 years or 2 years to where, I could pick out, consistently a spirit voice versus a radio voice. And I used to take my voice recorder and the Spirit Box with me wherever I go. Heck, I even have them in my camera bag when I go out, for my photography excursions or when I go do my filmmaking stuff. I still bring my Spirit Box and my voice recorder simply because you never know when, you're going to feel that spiritual presence near you.
That's right. And I'll tell you something I like to do with the Spirit Box, because that's one I like you was skeptical in the very beginning. And, and depending on where you're at, sometimes you get all radio noises and sometimes you get none. But I tell you what I like to do is I like to pull I always keep a recorder with the Spirit Box. And when I pull the audio off, I'll pull it into Audacity or my audio software, and I measure what my sweep rates are, and they show up on the audio bar on your computer. And so if you get a voice that falls within that sweep rate bar, then 9 times out of 10, that's a radio voice.
Right.
If the audio kind of, if you're going at a certain sweep rate that's this far apart and the audio voice falls outside of that sweep rate,
then it's a voice.
A lot of the time, yes, because at that point, it's more than likely broadcasting over broadband at that point.
Right.
So I like to check my audio on the Spirit Box by running it through or at least just looking at it through the equipment. I'll put it on there, on the video sometimes if I'm running a whole sequence. But
that's a really good idea.
Yeah, just to kind of double check. I like to do that because you can actually visually see it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, so you had mentioned your different projects that you work on. You'd mentioned your photography and videos. You want to talk a little bit about, I know there's a lot of different ways that people can follow what you're doing. Why don't you talk about some of the projects that you do as far as your documentaries, your photography, that sort of thing?
Okay, so for my photography, I do have facebook.com/Jake Fife Photography. I know, unique name, I know. But I take mainly landscape photos. I kind of take a little bit of everything because, I love to travel and I love to explore the world around me. And sometimes I find some really cool places. And, whenever I see a good photograph, I take it because you never know when you're going to be back there. For my film and all that stuff, I do it on the same page. I make a lot of short films actually with my brother. We're both into filmmaking, film history, stuff like that. And so we've made, I think at this point, 4 or 5 little short films at this point. We're working on one that's about to be released, and it's to be pretty good. I mean, I'm not an actor at all. I am probably the worst actor that's ever been on any form of a screen, but it's still fun to do because, you learn something as you go along, and, it's just fun to do. I mean, you have an idea in your head, you write it down, you plan it out thoroughly, and then you go out and actually film it. And then I like editing. I love editing. And so to be able to build it, in the video editor and then upload it and see people's reactions to it, see it get good reviews, it's one of the coolest feelings in the world. The most recent one we did was actually a horror short. It was like 3 minutes long, 2 or 3 minutes long. It's called Der Morder, which in German means the killer. And see, one of my favorite eras of film history is 1920s German expressionist films. You have stuff like Nosferatu, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and Metropolis. Those are some of my favorite films of all time, especially directed by Fritz Lang, Todd Browning, F.W. Murnau. And that was basically a silent film, in that style. And it's interesting if you watch, some of my short films and stuff like that, and then you go back and watch some of the Fife Paranormal stuff, there's similarities right there because I literally take the techniques I've watched from those early films and just apply them to Fife Paranormal because it works and it does look really cool. And that's something that, I'm sure this being a content creator yourself. When you're creating these videos for people, you want the best evidence possible. Credibility is above everything. It's above production. It's above, entertainment, flash, whatever you want to call it. But that is an element you have to have. You have to entertain people so that they will stay for the boring parts. Because sometimes, out of an 8-hour investigation, you're only going to get good stuff for maybe 20 to 30 minutes of that investigation.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, yeah. So you have about 7 to 7.5 hours of basically boring stuff, boring for most people's eyes. And so you have to make it, entertaining while still maintaining that credibility. And I'll be honest, it's really tough because, people see people on YouTube. I watch YouTube videos all the time, different channels, and I see people mimicking Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, Destination Fear. And I see the comments and they're like, oh, I saw this on Ghost Adventures. That means it's instantly fake. And, it gets on my nerves. And it kind of, when I first started making videos, they're boring. If you go back and watch some of my early stuff, which please don't, please don't, it's boring because, I literally just presented, the evidence. Like, a lot of the stuff was top 10 stuff. And it was like a singular image or me talking in front of a camera like this, way too close with terrible lighting. But that's because, I was scared to get that stigma attached that, if you're entertaining, you're instantly fake.
Right.
And over the years, I learned that, it's a balancing act. Sometimes you can fall, too much into the entertainment aspect of things, and you do start to lose credibility.
Yeah.
And, I'd like to think right now I'm at a point where I've balanced it well, but, you can always do better. And that's one of the things that's kind of fun about this is the learning process with it.
That's true. And for me, it was really finding that formula that worked, as far as, I knew what my goal was as far as what I wanted to tell and what I wanted to show, but then also trying to show it in a way. And, you brought up a really good point when you were talking about, the early videos versus the new ones. And then, trying to cover, the interesting parts. For me, it's important to show some of the parts that may seem a little boring just to kind of give that realistic side to what we do.
Right.
Because, either you're taking an episode and you're just kind of cutting the evidence and showing, here's my investigation, here's the evidence I had, or you're trying to tell the story. You're trying to tell the story of the location, but you're also trying to tell the story of yourself and your night or your couple trips to this specific location. And so trying to cull that, 8 hours down or those multiple trips down into a 20 to 30 minute time slot can be hard to still try to keep a consistent story flowing. So it's really just finding that sweet spot is really the most important part with that. And also having that mix of being entertaining, but then also, and then another thing that's kind of interesting for me is I write my stories before I go to some of these locations. I spend, I'd be interested to hear how much time you spend with your research and everything. For me, one video, the process is about 3 months. Yeah. And, there's different investigators, there's the top, the YouTubers that basically go and they just film in the moment and they don't put static recorders down. They don't put, other video and audio down. They just show what's happened in the moment and and the evidence they get is what they get in that moment. And then you've got, your urbexers and stuff. But I know for me, I will go and I'll do my research. If I can go to the local archives, talk to people, go wherever I can, and then go to the location. And, you've got all of this written and all of this planned out, but you don't really know once you go to the location, if you're going to get any activity. And so I kind of liken it to, you never know. And it may be a bad example, but it's like, you don't know if your actors are going to show up, for your show. Right. And so that can add an extra level of stress, but you just hope that the story and everything is interesting enough to carry the episode, even if there's not much activity.
Right. And it's, I'm the type of investigator, and my dad always makes fun of me for this. I go insane with my historical research. There was when we did our first investigation episode, which was in March of 2018. We went there March 15th of 2018. We went to the Nickerson Sneed House in Glade Springs, Virginia.
Yes.
And this whole wall behind me, which is my Once Upon a Time in Hollywood poster, my Jim Morrison poster, was completely full of sticky notes about every little thing that had ever occurred at the Nickerson Sneed House. And I didn't quite go to, I didn't go to the county courthouse or anything like that, because at that point I didn't have a car. And, I made that location and that investigation my obsession for about 2 weeks. I went to the most obscure places on the internet, even like one little mention of Nickerson Sneed, I wrote it down, because you never know when one little, bite of detail is going to be key and crucial to an investigation. You know, I knew that place, you know, better than the owners probably do. I was able to, you know, the guy that built it, Francis Kincannon, I knew his family's story going back like 200 years. You know, I traced them all the way back to the United Kingdom where they came from. I knew their motivations for leaving there a few hundred years earlier. I knew his reason for going to Pennsylvania and then coming down, working with George Washington. And, you know, even my dad was like, you know, Jake, you should probably take a day or two of rest, you know, because I probably had like an eye twitching at some point. And, you know, it was crazy, but it came in handy because on the investigation, I knew everything about that location and I knew the history of the general area. And I could ask location specific questions about certain people, certain events that had occurred there. And, you know, there were ghost stories about the location that didn't match up historical record because I base all my stuff on historical record. And part of the fun for me is, you know, you go to a place, there's a ghost of a little girl named Sally. Well, according to historical records, a little girl named Sally never lived here. So why is there a little ghost girl named Sally? And it's like, well, you know, let's ask Sally. And that's kind of the fun of it for me. And I do that with every location I investigate, you know, whether it's big name locations like St. Albans Sanatorium, Dejarnette, which I went unhealthily crazy into that research. Or even like, you know, a local cemetery that has like 10 graves in it. You know, I go to the same degree because, you know, especially now I think of all my investigation projects almost as, you know, because I make videos out of all of them. I'm like, you know, how can I create a story based off historical fact that will be interesting?
Right.
And so, you know, I usually do have a story in my head how I want to tell it, but kind of like what you were saying, when you actually get there, you know, things change. It's, you know, like it's like the old military saying, all battle plans are great plans until the first shot's fired. And that's kind of fun. And so I combine the historical story versus the paranormal story, which is based off the evidence that I get on the investigation. And I take all that information in my ungodly amount of sticky notes and I say, what's the story here? What is the truth? And how can I separate it from fiction? And that's basically how, you know, that's basically my workflow on every investigation.
That's awesome. And you can really see that in your videos.
Oh, thank you.
That's what I like. And, you know, you do with your videos, you do places that aren't just haunted, but also just rich in history as well, correct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, all the places I investigate, they can carry their own 30-minute video just based off the history alone. The paranormal stuff is just icing on top of the cake for me.
Exactly. And that's, you know, that's the type of investigators that I really like to follow myself. I mean, the investigation for myself and several others that I know is really secondary. It's like, you know, if you get something great, but if not, you know, here's this really great history and this great story to tell.
Right.
So that's something that's really cool. You mentioned a couple places just a second ago. What's your favorite location?
So my favorite location that I've ever investigated is St. Albans Sanatorium. I investigated there 6 or 7 times within the course of about 2 years.
Wow.
And I have never had a location still to this day affect me like that location has. And just my scariest experience happened there. You know, I met some of the coolest people there. In fact, my co-investigator for my first documentary, Caitlin, I met her there. And so I feel like, you know, St. Albans has kind of played a big part into making me the investigator I am today. And, you know, that's one of my favorite reasons for going back because, you know, St. Albans was the first big name location I investigated. I was invited. I was a member of a radio network group. I had my own podcast show at age 15. And when I turned 16, I was still in military school at this point. And they said, hey, Jake, do you want to investigate St. Albans? You know, don't worry that, you know, you're not 18. We can get you in. And so I was like, holy freaking crap. So of course I went. And that was the end of, you know, the first phase of my investigations. You know, I was no longer just doing cemeteries or abandoned, you know, barns or stuff like that, haunted roads with just a voice recorder and now a spirit box. I was actually doing a big name location. And, you know, there's I'm forever grateful for that opportunity and to have investigated that place because I've learned so much since then.
Yeah, I know I'm going to be going there for the first time in April, doing an event, Enigma Cons. And so I am so excited because I've heard so many great things about St. Albans and going to get to investigate it while I'm up there. So
it's a great place.
I may have to get with you and compare some notes before I go.
Lord knows I've got plenty of them.
And so I know there's another location that you cover a whole lot that is kind of a special location to you as well. You want to talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, the location she's referring to is Dejarnette Sanitarium, and that's located a few minutes from my house here in Stanton, Virginia. Now, this place, when we first moved up here, I remember driving by the highway because it's right next to Interstate 81. And it just looks like, the most imposing, evil place you've ever seen. It looks like something out of an Alfred Hitchcock movie, especially at night. And because, we would go there at night, we would get off the highway and we would actually drive right by it to go to the grocery store. And so, I just remember so many times looking out the window at night and just seeing this imposing building up against, the dark sky, the full moon lit behind it. And it was just, larger than life. And I'd always wanted to go there. And when I was 15 years old, I was given the chance by the local tour group to work security on the ghost tours there. It was going to be the last tours they were ever going to do there because they were planning on developing it or selling it off, tearing it down. There's so many things they tried to do with that place. And they say, this is it, no more. And I was very thankful, very lucky to be, a security guard on that, which, a 15-year-old security guard, probably not the best idea, but it was still cool. And everyone that was on our tours was really cool. I actually met a lot of people that were patients at Dejarnette back in the 60s and 70s. And that was, I still refer to those notes to this day. But Dejarnette was built in 1932. And in order to truly understand Dejarnette and why it's so infamous, you have to understand the American eugenics movement, which basically, a quick rundown, the eugenics movement was, they saw these people as quote unquote undesirables with bad genes. And these are people with, mental deficiencies, birth defects, stuff like Down syndrome, ADHD, PTSD from war, World War I, was still recent. And they said, these people are going to continue to breed. And that's a tainted bloodline because, their children, their grandchildren are going to have these defects. And so why don't we just eliminate the bloodline? And, it sounds awful, looking at it now. And it's the stuff that Nazis were doing. But, we came up with it first. But, that's just what they thought at the time. And so they tapped Dr. Joseph Dejarnette, who at that point was the director of Western State Hospital, which was built, I think in 1848 is when it was built. And it's actually right over the ridge from where Dejarnette is. And that's a really cool place. They've recently remodeled it into the Blackburn Inn. It's a pretty cool place. But basically, they gave him free reign to do whatever he wanted inside that place. And, there's no records that we have because most of the stuff is either locked away or it was destroyed when it shut down. But some of the stories, it's horrific, the stuff they were doing to those people. These god-awful experiments, there were gas chambers that were in the lower levels. Wow. And you have to understand these people were seen as, like cannon fodder. They were useless to society. Mm-hmm. And so, they would be sent to Dejarnette, which at that time was a private facility. And, the state of Virginia basically told him, hey, these people are going to be sterilized anyway, if not killed, why don't you work on some experiments on them, in the name of science to advance medicine. And so a lot of inhumane stuff was done to people. And, it's a really negative energy. I've talked to people that were there as children in the 60s, and they said they remember being there and just, seeing shadow figures, hearing ghost stories, and just, it was just a terrible environment. Tell you what kind of guy Joseph Dejarnette was. In 1932 through 1933, he was pen pals with Adolf Hitler himself.
I was about to ask you if he had any type of friendship or connection with Hitler.
Yep. Okay. To my knowledge, they exchanged multiple letters. I've actually tracked them down. One of my 3 a.m. research, outings. There's 2 letters that survived, to my knowledge, handwritten by Adolf Hitler in the Richmond archives.
Wow.
And I would love to go see that. But during that time, a lot of Nazi scientists came over to America, scientists, generals, and it's actually documented in a lot of newspapers that, they spent extensive time visiting hospitals, tuberculosis wings, and military schools and stuff in Virginia. Like Erwin Rommel, I think he went around VMI, went to some of Stonewall Jackson's old battlegrounds. There's stories that they went to places like Dejarnette and spent extensive time. They went to St. Albans, allegedly. It's really weird because, American eugenics kind of, it impressed the world because, this is this whole new way of thinking about purifying your nation's bloodline. And, the way they rationalized it was, why would you want bad people in your society? Because bad people breed worse people. And so that's why places like this were allowed to exist. Now in Nazi Germany, they took it to a whole other degree with the Holocaust and stuff like that, which, one of my theories is that, he might have gotten the gas chambers idea, from Dejarnette, because Dejarnette was one of the first people to actually start using mass gas chambers, on stuff like that. And there was even a quote in, I believe it was 1942, 1943, Dejarnette was talking to the General Assembly because some stuff was getting out about what was going on in Dejarnette, massive death tolls and stuff like that. And he straight up with a, plain face, all seriousness, said Germany is beating us at our own game for creating a better nation. And if we have any sense, we will ramp up our work in eugenics.
Wow.
And even after the Holocaust horrors were revealed, his own board at Dejarnette, they were like, we're doing some pretty shady stuff here. When Dejarnette first opened, there's a story, they have a crematorium nearby. And they had to stop it within a week because people in town were complaining that, it was being used too much. There was a report that it was used like 50 times per day within the first week of opening. Why were so many people dying within days of opening?
Wow.
So Dejarnette was headstrong in his ways. He got voted off his own board because, he was doing, he wanted to continue doing what they had been doing since the early 30s. And, allegedly the eugenics stopped after Dejarnette. I don't believe it did. I think it carried on into the 70s when it was turned into a children's school. I can't remember the name they gave it, but it was a children's hospital / school. And the story goes that allegedly 100 kids died under mysterious circumstances. No one knows how. And the kids were buried in this mass pit, either up in the woods, next to the pond is where they said it was, because people used to fish there and they'd report seeing bones and stuff.
Wow.
There's actually this motel, I can't remember the name of it, but allegedly they were buried in the front yard of that motel. And it's weird because when I worked at the movie theater nearby, I would go by that road and it is unnaturally even in the front part of the field. And it's kind of weird because it's kind of hilly, waving, and all of a sudden there's just flatness in this one little area. But that's, there's no historical record to back that up. But I have done many spirit box sessions. There's a Lowe's parking lot nearby. It's literally like 300 yards away. That's as close as you can get to it nowadays. But I have gotten children's voices come across saying buried here. And then when I have asked multiple times, are there children under my feet? I have gotten kids' voices saying yes. So that's my theory.
Were the kids in that school, were they orphans, or were there some disconnect from their family life, or?
So the thing about Dejarnette being a private wing was you could either be appointed there by the Virginia state for being mentally feeble through an examination, or you could be submitted there by a family member. And, kind of like, I guess, what they do nowadays, whoever checks you in has to check you out. And a lot of times people would literally leave their family members there and just forget about them. They didn't care what happened to them. And supposedly this is what happened even up until the private school days. So kids were being sent here for, various things, and they were just left there. Because, we talked about it on New Year's a little bit, but Dejarnette was where the roughest of the rough in the state of Virginia were sent. And, if these are people that would be considered killers and even serial killers, those kind of psychological builds, they were sent to Dejarnette. And Dejarnette didn't actually close until about 2001. So it's still, from 1933 until 2001, there's a lot of negative energy, a lot of useless death, experimentation. And some of the stories I have heard from people that are broken in there, it's just disturbing. There's this goat man entity that, supposedly attacks people. There's so many satanic rituals that were done there. There was a shootout between members of, I think it was like the Crips or Bloods and police, and like 13 people died in the building. And this was like 10 or so years ago. So this building knows nothing but death and torment. And when I was working on the ghost tours there, you could feel it. I remember so many times we would have to corral people in because you would see shadow figures circling us, very predatory. And, you would hear people scream inside. You would hear growls, all this craziness. And I actually did the very last spirit box session that was legally allowed on the grounds on our very last tour near Halloween. I think it was the week before Halloween we did our last one. And I got some terrifying responses. And still this day, even at the Lowe's parking lot, 300 yards away, I still get disturbing stuff. But that's why Dejarnette holds a special place for me, because there's a lack of historical record, yet there's, oodles of paranormal evidence and eyewitness accounts about stuff that has taken place in there. And one day I would love to separate fact from fiction and tell the true story of Dejarnette, because I think there are a lot of lost souls there. And I think they're being held hostage by these evil spirits, demonic spirits. And I think, sometimes by telling their stories, you can free them. And I would like to help them out and maybe their descendants in any way I can.
So when you said you had spoke with some of the different patients from there, were these people that had just spent time there and they had been checked out, or they had recovered, I guess, or
a mix of both? A mix of both. There's a well-known ghost story. This little kid in the early 60s, he checked in, had nothing wrong with him. The parents, I can't remember if they couldn't afford to have him or, they couldn't afford his medical bill, so they sent him there. And the story goes that every day he expected his parents to come back, and they never did. And the story goes that over time, he kind of lost the will to live. And this kid was like 5 or 6 years old. And he lost the ability to speak. He lost the ability to walk. It was just very sad. And then one day they found him dead in his room. And the story goes that whenever you're there, if he takes a liking to you, you'll hear a wheelchair follow you when you leave. And you have to tell him, you have to stay here. This is your home. And you have to walk him back to the building. That's a local legend around here. So one of our last few tours we were there, is me and this one girl. We would always go back with flashlights. It was terrifying. Pitch darkness, just 2 flashlights. Because it's like a 200-yard walk up a single road to the building itself. And I just remember just feeling something following me, going up to the building and going back. And we were walking. I was talking to the guide. We were cutting up. And you could hear squeaking behind us. And so I would stop, and you could hear like, ee. And we figured out it was the sound of a wheelchair. You could literally hear the gravels being moved. And I figured out it had to have been the spirit of that kid that was following us. And so we got up to the front, and I told the main guide, I was like, hey, we're hearing a wheelchair follow us. And he knew what we were talking about. And he said, I'm sorry, Jake, you're going to have to go back up to the building. And so I did. In the entire way, I walked back up there by myself. And mind you, I was 15 at the time. And I was just talking to him. I was like, I'm sorry what happened to you. You have to stay here. And you could hear the wheelchair. I wish I had my voice recorder with me, because you could hear the wheelchair, plain as day behind me, walking up there with me. And there was this old lady on the ghost tour the week after. And she actually was there when the little kid was there. So she knew him.
Oh, wow.
And she was able to tell me a little bit about, his story. She remembers seeing him sitting by the windows, that he didn't talk to anyone. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and that they kept him apart from everyone else, the other kids. But she said that she remembered just him not being there one day. And I asked her, I said, do you know, more of the question, what did they do with the body? I was like, did someone come for him? And she said, to her knowledge, no one ever did. So that just begs the question, what did they do with his body?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, do you think that, well, why did they close it down for tours and investigations?
I don't know the full story. The story that I was told was, they were annoyed with staffing it. And then also there was a lot of insurance liability because, the property has not been well maintained.
Yeah.
And, it's my theory that they're hiding something, because there for a time, you can go online, type in Dejarnette, you're going to see a lot of postcards of the place. It's beautiful. It is a beautiful structure. And it's interesting, they kept it up in the 30s. They had a swimming pool, tennis courts, this luxurious golf course. And I've talked to, older men, and they said they remember when they were young that a lot of the old timers had their business meetings on the golf course at Dejarnette. And so think about, all these terrible things were happening to people inside the building. These people are out here, on the 9 holes talking about, big business decisions. And there was a story I heard from the 80s that, this guy was in a sand trap, because he sucked at golf, kind of like me. And he remembers, hitting the ball with all of his might, and then a human hand appeared. And people started finding human bones on the golf course. And shortly after, they stopped doing golf at Dejarnette. They stopped doing the pool. They covered up the tennis court. And there's theories that, kind of like what the Nazis did with Auschwitz, they dug these trenches. And they were typically in, kind of V patterns. If you watch a lot of historical archives, they dug that stuff because they were easy to stack bodies and they were easy to fill in. Typically they had the people dig their own graves, all that stuff. I think they did a similar thing at Dejarnette, because the land isn't suited for like a singular plot. Bury one person here, bury another person next to them. It had to have been pits that they dug. And I think they're a little worried that people, walking around the grounds, they might discover something.
Have you heard a number of how many people is rumored to have passed there? Everything from, like you said, the stuff that happened after it shut down to, from when it's start to, I guess, basically now. Have you heard any numbers?
I've heard some crazy numbers. Like I said, there are no historical records for Dejarnette. Most of the stuff, putting this disclaimer out there, is based off my experiences, stories from people that were there, because, they hid the records. There are actually some records that are still inside Dejarnette. And I've heard numbers between 100 died there to up to 20,000 died there. Now, I think the truth is probably between about 400 to probably 2,000 died there, because that kind of somewhat matches the totals of some of these other locations. But, since Dejarnette was such a huge complex, and it had truly the worst of the worst, and almost, a 90-year history, 80, 90-year history, it had to have had an interesting death toll.
Absolutely. So do you think that Dejarnette was just a maniacal person, or do you think that he truly, kind of started in the name of science and just kind of got carried away?
I think that's what it was, because Dejarnette, I'm going to get into a little conspiracy theories here. I'm going to put on my tinfoil hat for people at home.
Please do.
So Dejarnette's father was involved in the Confederate government. And he had close ties before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War with the United States government. And see, a lot of Confederate presidents, officers, and stuff like that, people that were in the cabinet, they were jailed or they were closely monitored after the war, but not the Dejarnette family. In fact, they gained more power after the war. And supposedly his family was involved. There's a famous story about the Confederate gold, millions of dollars lost after, the South lost. Dejarnette's family was actually in charge of, overseeing what was done with that money. And there's a theory that they were the ones who orchestrated, where that money went. So Dejarnette, after the Civil War, went to the Robert E. Lee School for Boys. And he graduated top of his class in medical field. And he actually, published like a poem. He was a poet, believe it or not. And one of the lines in his poetry after he graduated was, "I truly believe I am the greatest member of my family." Word for word. That's what he thought of himself. And it's interesting because, between when he started at Western State and I think it's 1888, 1889 is when he started, up until about 1905, he won so many awards. I mean, you can go on westernstate.com and see the awards this guy won. I mean, he was like the Michael Jordan of the medical field in this area. And it's interesting because he was winning awards like best doctor in the country, best doctor in Virginia consistently. And, his patients had a high recovery rate. He had a low mortality rate. And it's just, there's a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was doing my research on Dejarnette, because a few years back for Halloween, I did a 38-minute long video about Dejarnette. And I was like, I was talking about, late Dejarnette when he got his asylum versus early Dejarnette. It's not the same person. Something happened. And so around 1904, 1905, he became the director of Western State. And his goal was to bring it back to its former glory. And he started cutting costs in different places, especially with staffing. But he started importing more patients in. So, that's recipe number 1 for disaster. And this is going to sound crazy, but I noticed a decline in his reputation after he got married. He got married to this local girl. I can't remember her name, but she was a member of a prominent family. And apparently she was a very hard-headed woman, very stubborn. And she was actually a nurse at Western State. And, from all accounts that people that knew them, she kind of bossed him around. And that, he was kind of a, yes, dear, whatever you want, whatever makes you happy, that kind of person. Gotcha. And I have wondered if, she kind of egged him on to do some of the more crazy stuff. Because, she had been a nurse since she was young. And they didn't get the fair wages that they should have been getting for the work they were doing, especially when he started cutting the staff numbers. And I think that she started planting in his ear that, in order to get more people in, to get more revenue, you're going to have to, embrace this new experimental stuff like eugenics. You're going to have to do this new age craft that, that's getting government funding. Mm-hmm. Because at the time, the government was funding a lot of new age stuff because, they wanted, it was an arms race, not just between the country and country, but state to state. They wanted bragging rights to come up with the next big advancement. And it was between mainly Virginia, New York, and California. Those were the 3 states that were trying to one-up each other. And I think that, it just started getting more diabolical as the years went on. And then finally, once eugenics was realized, I think he had given into it at that point. But that's my theory, is that he started having a mental decline and that she was feeding into it.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, because it's almost unbelievable when you really start to sit down and study and see some of the things that they were actually doing to these humans, these people.
It's terrible. And, it just, and what's cool about that, a story like this would seem so black and white, Dejarnette bad, what he did was bad. But when you start looking at, you see a character, a man who existed in history, go from top of the line, best in his field. He was, on lecture circuits all over the East Coast. And, his patients loved him. They said that he was one of the best doctors you could have. He took care of them. He even paid for a lot of their treatments out of his own pocket. So he went out of his way to make sure these people survived. And, there's between 1905 and 1933, something happened that caused him to, lose faith in people and to want to, just not straight up turn into a murderer, but start giving into those kind of tendencies.
I mean, that is such a sharp turn when you put it that way. That somebody could go from that to, what he became.
Yeah, still to this day, all the research I've done, I still can't pinpoint, a cause of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. And I would love to investigate that location. I know my parents were up that way on a bus trip and they stopped there, and they actually stopped. It may have been the Lowe's parking lot because my mom was talking about that location. They stopped and they were telling them about it. And she was talking about it being the red building and asking if I'd ever investigated there or had ever heard of it. So, that's the little bit that I had heard from that, and then just some of the stories, and then some of your videos that you've put out. So just completely fascinating. So I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's one of those things, it's the most dangerous topic I've tackled. When I recently did my Halloween thing this year, I actually got kicked out of Western State. I don't even know why, because, I used to go there all the time and take photos. When I got my new camera, I went there to test it out. The people there at the Stab Blackbird Inn, they're really cool, really nice. I've been all over those grounds. The original Dejarnette building, built in 1913, is on the grounds of Western State. And that's actually where he did the lobotomies. He didn't do the lobotomies in Dejarnette. He did it in his private facility, which I know of at least 40 deaths attributed to that in a year. But this last time when I was doing my documentary, I was only inside for maybe 2 minutes. And I just felt this, it was almost like a feeling of dread or just negativity. And I was like, something's different. Something's not right. And I was, it was the first time I'd been there by myself. And it was one of the employees. He's like, what are you doing here? And I'd seen him before. He was a really nice guy, but this time he really wasn't. And I was just telling him, I was like, I'm just up here taking some photos, taking videos, stuff like that. And he was like, no, you need to leave. He said, no, get off, just leave. And the whole time that I was there, because there's a retirement community next to Western State, and I was taking B-roll, taking photos of it. And there were people watching me from the windows at the staff. There were people in cars on the side. Not sound paranoid, but I do believe I was being watched the whole time I was there. And then when I went up to the Lowe's parking lot afterwards at night to do my Dejarnette Spirit Box sessions, there were some cars, like I noticed 2 cars that had been at Western State, and I just happened to notice them, a few spots behind me. And, that's the first time on any of my investigations I've had that happen. And so, of course, I'm like, I didn't tell anyone I was working on this project.
Yeah.
And I was like, how do they know? And I was like, that's kind of strange. And so I'm not going to make more than, what it is of it. It could have been just a crazy coincidence. But, there was a little fear working on that project.
Well, yeah, because you just never know what you might uncover, and people don't want that out there.
Yeah, well, think about it like this, not to interrupt, but the people that were there working on the staff, I know their names. In the 1970s, when the kids died, they're still around, and they're still involved in local politics, business, and all that stuff. So they're all still around, and that's not information that they want out.
Right.
And, here comes me, 20-year-old, just kind of pulling back the curtains like, guess what these guys did? That's a recipe for disaster.
That's true. Well, like I said, just completely fascinating. And we're going to wrap up here in just a few minutes. That went by so fast.
It did.
And, yeah, it was so much fun. But if you want to go ahead and kind of repeat where people can watch some of your past videos, and then also any future, is there anything in particular that you can talk about that you're working on coming up?
So right now I'm outlining 3 documentaries I'm working on. One is Bigfoot of West Virginia, which the idea behind it is I'm going to go back to my hometown and investigate some of the Bigfoot stories I heard as a kid. And then also I've had a few encounters with Bigfoot, so I'm going to reinvestigate that. The second one is about the West Virginia mine wars. And if you've never researched that, it's one of the coolest topics in history. I could talk easily 2 hours about that. But I want to go back. I went to Matewan a few years ago where the Matewan massacre happened. I investigated it. It was really cool. The whole town was awesome. Got to investigate a museum. They actually took the display cases off and let me hold artifacts in the museum. It was so cool. But I want to go back there and tell the full story, and then, have the paranormal stuff sprinkled in. And then the project I'm probably going to work on first here, probably in the next month or so, is Ghosts of Guilford. And that's based around the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, fought on March 16, 1781, which is my favorite battlefield I've ever been to. And there's a mystery behind it, that there's this headless horseman that haunts the second line. The courthouse, which is where the battle gets its name from, disappeared. It was burned, I think, in the 1790s, and still this day, no one knows where it is. And local universities have spent millions of dollars trying to find this little courthouse, and they never have. But I think I know where it is based on some contemporary accounts and maps I've studied, and I want to go find it using historical knowledge and then contacting the spirits. And I'm really excited to get that one underway.
That's very cool. You'll have to... go ahead.
Oh, thanks. People can find me on Facebook.com/Fife Paranormal. That's where my paranormal stuff is. I do a lot of my haunted photography there as well. If you want to follow my filmmaking and photography stuff, it's official Jake Fife. On YouTube, it's Fife Paranormal. We're actually 4 subscribers away from 700, so I'm hoping to hit that by Saturday, my birthday. And then I've got my youtube.com/Jake Fife, which is where I do my historical documentaries, which is mainly Civil War battles, Revolutionary War stuff. And then we are on Instagram, Fife Paranormal, Instagram.com, and then Fife Paranormal at Twitter.com.
Okay. And what I'll do is, if you'll send me some of that information, I know that I've got some of that already, and I've put some of that here in the comments, and I've got it scrolling across the bottom there. But if you'll send me some of your other information, I'll put it on the post. I'll edit that, put it on the post, and then I'm also going to be downloading this here probably within the next hour and putting it on YouTube. So I'll put all of your information in the notes there on YouTube as well. And if you want, I'd love it if you came back whenever you got your documentaries out, especially the one on the Mine Wars. I'd love to hear more about that, because I grew up in Northeast Tennessee along the Kentucky line. It's a lot like, West Virginia there, with a lot of mining and that sort of thing. So I'd love to have you come back and talk about some of that.
Yeah, I'd love to be on the show. Once again, thanks for having me on. This was a blast. It felt like only 20 minutes has gone by, but we're already at the hour and minute mark. Right. And also, for the people that are currently listening, thank you all for tuning in tonight, especially for me rambling. I know that's usually what my stuff turns into, but thank you all. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me either on my personal page or one of my social media pages. I'm happy to answer any and all questions.
You got any big plans for that 21st birthday?
No, unfortunately, I have to work all weekend. So I do have a special video out on YouTube now where I talk about, extensively my upcoming documentary projects I just named here.
Okay.
So that's about the only special thing I've got planned for that.
Gotcha. Well, I want to take a few minutes to talk about something that I've got going on next week. I'm trying to have another guest. It'll be probably next Saturday night. It's unconfirmed, but I'm trying to get Ryan Rush back on. He was originally going to come on a few weeks ago, and we had some internet issues and weren't able to do that. We're going to be talking about the topic. Ryan is he has the Paranormal Rush Hour, as well as he's a Bigfoot guy. We're going to be talking about missing 411 cases, which is something that's always interested me. And he's done some interesting research on that. So if we get him confirmed, we'll have more information on that. And then I'm also participating in the Festival of the Unexplained event next weekend, which goes to benefit CALM, which is a campaign against living miserably. And the funds for that goes to suicide prevention and awareness. So the Festival of the the Festival of the Unexplained is a UK paranormal event. And so they're having speakers from all over the UK, as well as the US, maybe a couple other countries. But that event is going to run Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And all the times and everything, I'll have information on that, but the times will be listed. I will specifically be doing my live on Sunday at 11 p.m. Eastern time. So a lot of really cool things on our end coming up next week that we'll be announcing here within the days to come. So again, thank you guys for coming on. I'm going to go back and read the comments and try to specifically, address those and everything. And again, we're going to post this on YouTube and be doing it as a live premiere. And so just thank everyone for taking the time out to spend this afternoon with us. And we're going to, until next time, we'll tell you good night. So thanks, everyone.
Y'all have a good night.